If you've ever met someone who studies psychology or deeply understands human behavior and notice they treat their birthday like it doesn't exist, no celebration, no attention, no fanfare, you might think they're just being modest or private, but the truth is far more interesting, because psychology says that people who understand the mechanics of the mind often develop a completely different relationship with concepts like celebration, identity, and the passage of time. And once you see how a psychologist's brain processes something as culturally sacred as a birthday, you'll understand why they quietly opt out, while everyone else is still chasing cake and candles. People who study psychology or immerse themselves in understanding human behavior aren't rejecting birthdays out of coldness. They're rejecting the psychological constructs that make birthdays feel necessary in the first place. And once you deconstruct the why behind a ritual, it becomes almost impossible to participate in it the same way again. And that's exactly what happens inside the mind of someone trained to question everything. The first thing you need to understand is that psychology-minded people recognize birthdays as a form of socially constructed milestone. And research shows that milestones are arbitrary markers we use to organize time, but your brain doesn't actually need them to measure growth or worth. And when you study cognitive psychology, you learn that the brain operates on continuity, not on calendar dates. So celebrating one specific day out of 365 starts to feel performative, because psychologists know that personal growth happens in untracked moments, during quiet realizations, during failures, during random Tuesday afternoons when no one is watching. And they've trained themselves to value those invisible shifts over visible celebrations. And once you see birthdays as a social script rather than a personal truth, it becomes hard to keep performing that script year after year without feeling like you're lying to yourself. Another layer is that people in psychology are hyper-aware of something called the spotlight effect, which is a cognitive bias where we overestimate how much others notice or care about us. And research shows that most people celebrate birthdays, partly because they believe others expect it, because they fear being seen as weird or ungrateful if they don't. And psychology students learn early on that this fear is irrational, because most people are too consumed with their own lives to care whether you had a party or not. The social pressure to celebrate evaporates. And once you internalize that truth, because you realize that the only person who truly cares about your birthday performance is you, and if you don't need it, then why waste emotional energy on something designed to please an audience that isn't even paying attention? And this is why psychology-minded people often skip birthdays entirely. They've already done the mental math and decided the return on investment isn't worth it. There's also a deeper concept that psychologists live with every day called existential awareness, which means they're constantly conscious of mortality, impermanence, and the fleeting nature of identity. And when you study developmental psychology or existential therapy, you spend a lot of time thinking about how humans create meaning in a universe that doesn't hand it to them. And birthdays are one of those meaning-making rituals we invented to feel like we're progressing through life in a linear, comprehensible way. But people trained in psychology see through that illusion, because they know that aging isn't progress, it's just biological change, and celebrating it annually is like throwing a party every time your cells divide. And once you strip away the emotional narrative around birthdays, what's left is just another day. And psychology-minded people would rather spend that day doing something genuinely meaningful than performing a ritual that only exists because society said it should. Then there's the issue of emotional labor and something called celebration fatigue, which psychologists are acutely sensitive to because they understand how much energy it takes to manage other people's expectations. And research shows that birthdays often become more about making others comfortable than about genuine self-reflection. And when you study social psychology, you realize that most birthday traditions exist to reinforce group cohesion, not individual joy. And psychology people are already spending their mental energy analyzing human behavior in their work or studies. So when their own birthday comes around, the idea of performing happiness, answering repetitive questions, and managing the emotional needs of party guests feels exhausting because their brains are wired to crave authenticity over performance, and they'd rather have one deep conversation with someone who truly knows them than 50 surface-level happy birthday messages from acquaintances who won't remember them next week. Finally, psychology-minded individuals often operate from a framework called intrinsic motivation theory, which means they derive satisfaction from internal values rather than external rewards. And your brain produces dopamine when you accomplish something meaningful to you, not when someone else acknowledges a date you had no control over. And people who study psychology have trained themselves to separate self-worth from external validation, because that's literally what half of therapy is, teaching people to do. So when their birthday rolls around, they don't need the party, the gifts, or the attention, because their sense of identity isn't tied to how others perceive or celebrate them. And research shows that people with high intrinsic motivation are actually happier long-term because they're not dependent on unpredictable external sources for their emotional stability. And psychology people have internalized this so deeply that birthdays just feel irrelevant, like celebrating the fact that the Earth completed another orbit around the sun, which technically isn't even an achievement. It's just physics. So if you know someone who studies psychology or thinks like a psychologist, and they treat their birthday like any other ordinary day, it's not because they're joyless or disconnected from life. It's because they've already deconstructed the entire concept, analyzed the social scripts, questioned the underlying motives, and decided that their mental energy is better spent elsewhere. And psychology says this isn't avoidance, it's informed choice. And the irony is that the very people who understand human behavior the best are often the ones who refuse to participate in the behaviors everyone else assumes are mandatory. And maybe that's the healthiest response of all. If this made sense to you, and you've ever felt like celebrating your birthday was more exhausting than exciting, hit subscribe, because we break down the psychology behind behaviors that others misunderstand. And if you're someone who quietly skips your own birthday every year, drop a comment. You're not weird, you're just awake.